And the Mirror says BBC bosses have snubbed a call by David Cameron to launch a full investigation into the Jimmy Savile sex abuse scandal. The Prime Minister said claims about the late start were shocking and urged the corporation to hold an urgent inquiry.
A growing number of people claim there was a culture within the organisation that allowed inappropriate behaviour, at the very least, to flourish. Well, Jim Gamble is the former head of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre. He joins us live now from Belfast. Very good morning to you. First of all, let's talk about the police investigation and what they'll be considering at the moment going forward.
Well, I mean, the police are mounting what I believe to be an assessment at the moment, not an actual investigation. It's very difficult to investigate someone who's dead. They don't have a contemporary crime scene. So what they'll be doing is looking at the range of allegations that have been made, the range of public statements that they have, and engaging with people to assess whether or not there is enough for them to mount a full-blown criminal investigation.
There's lots of questions about these allegations. Of course, Jimmy Savile is not here to answer them any longer. Questions mainly about why these women have waited so long to come forward. In your experience, what do children who suffer abuse go through when it comes to considering whether or not to inform the authorities?
Well, it's so difficult for people to come forward, and even more difficult when you're talking about a potential perpetrator of the status of Jimmy Savile, because he had wealth, he had fame, he had influence. So young people very often feel complicit in the commission of this type of offence against them. They're drawn into a relationship which they're told is special. They're told that this is a secret between you and me, and we must never tell anyone else. So they feel as if it's partly their fault, which of course it isn't. And it often takes many years for them to come to terms with what's happened to them, for them to be able to face up to it, even to themselves. And coming forward is an extremely courageous step. And by coming forward, they not only help themselves, I believe, but they also send out a signal of hope to other victims. And I would encourage anyone watching your programme who's been the subject of sexual abuse as a child to come forward. It's never too late to come forward, and by coming forward, you may be stopping someone in their tracks.
Because many people may forget how powerful a figure Jimmy Savile was. Not just, of course, Jim will fix it, but he presented Top of the Pops for many years, seen as an almost rock god, wasn't he? On a par with many of the pop stars of the day.
Well, I mean, absolutely, and with that came incredible influence. And that's why the police investigation can only be one part of this. The police assessment can only be one part. There's a broader need for a review that looks at how institutions, including the BBC, dealt with this at the time. Who knew what? What did they do about it? And if they did nothing, why didn't they do something? So I welcome and applaud the fact that the Director General of the BBC has demonstrated real leadership by coming forward and saying that he's sorry. But if they're going to have an internal review, if they want that to be credible, they have to make sure that it has people within the review team who have the experience and, critically, the independence that will deal with the perception, perhaps, that this culture of cover-up still exists in the organisation.
What about other organisations? Are there parallels to be drawn, if indeed there was a culture of a cover-up at the BBC, but are there parallels to be drawn with perhaps the church and other institutions where we've seen a systemic child abuse covered up?
I don't think there's any public organisation, third sector or business, a large business organisation, that would look back on its culture in the 1970s and think that culture was appropriate when it came to children and young people, in fact, those who may be vulnerable to abuse. So whether it's the police service, the church, or other institutions in the media, there is a history there. The difficulty with the Jimmy Savile issue is that everyone's trying to put it in the context of a particular time, the 1970s. I, for one, don't accept that. The people that are coming out now and saying, well, I knew this, we knew it, we knew there was no point in reporting. They lived in the 1980s and the 1990s and are here today providing a commentary on this. So it's not good enough. It's not good enough to say, well, back in the 70s. Because Jimmy Savile didn't die in the 70s, and nor did some of these people who are coming out providing us with their opinion.
What about the culture? You say you don't accept that that's any kind of excuse, but what safeguards were possibly in place then? I appreciate you didn't work at the BBC, you might not have known, but certainly as far as Top of the Pops were concerned, you had to be over 18 to enter the studios. Jim Will Fix It obviously had a much younger audience and people who were invited in, but do you know about procedures that were in place to protect young people there?
Well, I don't think I could, pretend to be an expert on what procedures were in place in the 1970s. I'm sure they had the veneer of procedure there, but this is more about attitude. It's more about a particular perception that some people are above any kind of procedure, any kind of clearance, or any kind of scrutiny. And I'll repeat this because I think for the people that are viewing the programme, it's really important that we simplify this. The 1970s weren't 100 years ago. And if you were someone who knew what Jimmy Savile was doing, the question for you is, would you have allowed your child to get into his Rolls Royce or to go into his dressing room with him? And if you knew enough at the time that you wouldn't let your child do that with Jimmy Savile, then for goodness sake, why would you let someone else's child go into that dressing room or into his Rolls Royce for a drive around the block? So I don't accept what people are saying about the context of the 1970s. Victims will be watching your programme and they'll be listening to other programmes and reading material on this. We need to reassure them that we're going to deal with this effectively. There needs to be a wide-ranging review, and people need to know that there are pathways to reporting. If you can't break out of your own organisation or institutional culture, you need to go to the police. Crime Stoppers has existed from 1988. I would like to know how many reports were made about suspicions relating to Jimmy Savile. I'd like to know whether any of the charities involved received letters of complaint about Jimmy Savile and children. That's the type of broad review that will reinstitute the confidence that victims need if they're going to come forward.
What about the role that journalists played? Paul Gambaccini's been quoted in one paper saying that Jimmy Savile played the papers like a Stradivarius, said that if any of these allegations had any suggestion of being raised, he would threaten to pull his support for the many charities that he supported, and they complied.
Well, I think there's two things there. First of all, if Paul Gambaccini is saying that he played the press like a Stradivarius, was he in the audience listening? And if he was, why didn't he stand up and object? That's number one. Number two, I think, let's be real here. Without the media, we wouldn't be aware of the full extent of the issues relating to the allegations against Jimmy Savile. So the media play a constructive role. And we shouldn't forget that, because in the context of what's going on with Levison and other inquiries, we could almost get to a position where the media feels that it can't come forward. So we need an open environment. We need one where victims can come forward and report, and where witnesses or people who think they know something feel confident about reporting. And I don't accept that the charities wouldn't have got the money. If you believe a child is being abused, are you going to prostitute them by simply saying, well, you know what, I'm not going to say anything this time because I'm worried that charity won't get X amount of money? That's a nonsense. None of the charities that I'm aware of would ever want that. If you believe that, you weren't serving the charities well, and you weren't serving the children and young people who were engaging with Jimmy Savile and perhaps others well.
Jim Gamble, thank you very much. Fascinating insight into these allegations. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's really going to have to let things sink in and talk to various people who knew him. I think we get the idea that, this, whatever has happened, there's something very unpleasant that's been going on. And so therefore the Jimmy Savile name is going to be very difficult for people to think of in a good light. So there's a lot of money which is going to be, 1 month ago we were planning on giving out significant amounts to charities all around Britain. That's very much in jeopardy now, and we have to say, well, are we going to change the names? Are we going to wind them up? We have no idea at the moment what we're going to do. We're going to meet in a couple of weeks and then sit down and discuss it.
Dr. Roger Bodley speaking to Martine a little earlier.